Welcome, friends, to another important topic in our discussion series with the Network of Evangelicals for the Middle East, or NEMI as we like to call it. This particular discussion is also co-sponsored by our friends at Churches for Middle East Peace. We're coming to you today on a bitter day, October 7th, the one-year anniversary of the horrific day a year ago when around 1,200 people were slaughtered. Since then, of course, we've seen tens of thousands of lives extinguished in Gaza and now increasingly in Lebanon, too, along with Israel's military casualties, well over 100,000 injured across the region, and the infrastructure and buildings of Gaza are pulverized. And we're here to ask this question: is the war that's unfolding in the region, and particularly for today, the war in Gaza, is it just? Many have said yes, that Israel's war in Gaza is tragic, but just. Sad, but just. Horrendous, but just. And we want to examine that notion today. I'm Ben Norquist. I'm the director of the Network of Evangelicals for the Middle East, and I'm joined by some really remarkable people today. I'm delighted to have Dr. Eric Patterson, Reverend Susie Hayward, and Dr. Scott Gustafson on the call today. I'll be introducing each of them along the way, but delighted that they could join us. So thank you so much for each of you that have taken time to contribute your perspective and your expertise to us really today. It's an honor to have you on. And Hannah Hutton is producing this discussion and helping behind the scenes. So thank you, Hannah, as well. When I think about the chance that we have to listen in on these particular panelists, one of the things that I most feel is gratitude and the sense of privilege to hear from these folks. And I want to invite you into feeling that as well. But speaking to our listeners, I also want to say thank you to you. I feel grateful to you too, because we live in such a busy world, and we all lead such busy lives that really we show what we most value by what we spend our time on. And you're here spending your time with us. And so I want to extend gratitude to you for that as well. We're going to be hearing from our panelists over the course of the next hour or so, and then there's going to be time, we're hoping, for discussion, some give and take. The panelists will have a chance to talk with each other about what they heard. But if you have questions, be popping them into the comments underneath the video in the YouTube window, and we'll be looking at those. We may grab some of those questions to toss into that discussion time a little bit later as well. And you can drop those questions in along the way. As you have them, I invite you to put them in there. Okay. Where is this conversation coming from? I want to spend just a couple of minutes setting the table for our discussion today. Soon after October 7th, within a few days probably, I started hearing my fellow evangelicals talking about the war in Gaza in terms of just war theory. Most of the time using just war theory principles to evaluate Hamas's actions as evil and Israel's actions as tragic, but ultimately just and even noble, I would say, in some circumstances, in some cases. For me, personally, it was pretty jarring working as I do at NEMI, a Network of Evangelicals for the Middle East, every day with stories I was working with and encountering stories every day about children dying from preventable diseases, new mothers too malnourished to produce milk for their babies, 2,000-pound bombs extinguishing whole families in an instant. All of that on one hand, that hell on earth on one hand, and then to hear my fellow evangelicals sometimes almost kind of breezily deploying just war theories to frame what was happening as sadly necessary and justified. It was creating a kind of cognitive dissonance for me. It was like my community had of evangelicals here in the U.S. had this initial gut reaction to seeing news about the widespread carnage, first in Israel on the 7th, and then increasingly in Gaza over the course of this last year. And the initial gut level intuitive response was moral horror, was that of moral horror. But then these voices would come along on podcasts mostly and in articles and cast Gaza as a just war. And those voices this is sort of my, how I've perceived how they've functioned in my community. They helped my community relieve or soothe some of that moral horror that they initially would feel. And help them put that sense of horror and deep discomfort into a box and to set it aside where it wouldn't have as much of an effect on their daily life. And I found that to be a little bit disturbing. So that's a bit of an impetus for this conversation today. But then there's more. For me personally, another significant moment came when I read a series of investigative articles based on testimony from 6 Israeli whistleblowers about the ways in which Israel is using artificial intelligence to generate its list of targets for airstrikes. These articles, published by 972 magazine, suggested that which I think I have a banner, Hannah, citing those. Yeah, that's great. If you're interested in reading what I'm talking about, you can find the reference there at the bottom. These articles, published by 972 magazine, suggested that the massive destruction and widespread carnage resulting from Israel's bombing campaign was connected, at least in part, to their use of new AI, relatively new AI programs that were designed and implemented in some really problematic ways. The whistleblowers described the AI generating long lists of human targets, for example, that were given then no more than 30 seconds to double check each target before authorizing a strike. A human double check of what the AI had identified as a military target. Got about 30 seconds, at least in some cases, of human oversight per target. That's allegedly, according to these whistleblowers. And then another interviewee said that Israel used lists of civil employees in Gaza in the training of the AI, which would tend to condition the AI to identify civil government employees like librarians, trash collectors, emergency personnel, and so on as valid targets. There were a whole variety of other problems as well. And that would tend to make these AIs indiscriminate by design. At least that's how you would read that. That's how I read it. And that then in the backdrop of voices casting what was happening as a just war, even stronger sense of dissonance. One of the most prominent evangelical voices out there using just war theory to explain Israel's actions in Gaza is David French. David is a conservative commentator for the New York Times, a Harvard-trained lawyer, and a former JAG officer who served in Iraq. So he's got a lot of experience and has thought about these things from both a military operational perspective and from a legal perspective as well. And he frequently starts, when he's on podcasts or writing an article for the New York Times, frequently starts with some basic concepts. And I'm going to play a couple of clips of David. Here he is on the Good Faith podcast in January 24, defining some key terms. This is pretty typical of the way that he sometimes starts when he is talking about just war in Gaza.
Curtis, you and I have talked about just war doctrine before, and it really has two components. One is called jus ad bellum, and the other one is called jus in bellum. So one is the law of when is war acceptable? When is it acceptable to fight a war? That's jus ad bellum, right cause for war. And then there is how do you fight a war? That's jus in bellum. What is right conduct in war? Curtis, you and I have talked about just war doctrine before, and it really has two components. One is
he also frequently describes the pillars of just war doctrine, principles like necessity, honor, distinction, and proportionality, and he'll offer definitions. He likes, for example, to clarify that there's a lot of misunderstanding around the idea of proportionality. It's not that, eye for an eye kind of a thing. It's not that, if someone kills 10 people, then you can kill 10 people back, but not 100 people. It's not like that. It has to do with the proportionality between the military objective and the risk to civilians. So that's all pretty common for David French. He often then describes how he sees these principles applying to what's happening in Gaza. So this next clip, he's talking about who is legally responsible for the death of civilians when Israel attacks Hamas.
When Hamas hides behind civilians, and if our targeting processes are sound, and we target Hamas or ISIS, so America, we would target ISIS or Al-Qaeda in Iraq or the Taliban or whatever, that if your targeting process is sound and you hit ISIS or you hit Hamas and civilians are killed in that attack, then the legal responsibility for the death of the civilians is with Hamas or with ISIS, because they're not supposed to be hiding amongst civilians, and I have a right to defend myself against ISIS or Hamas. But that is not, to say that does not grant carte blanche to my response, because my response still has to be tempered by discrimination, necessity, proportionality. And so I cannot simply say, well, Hamas doesn't comply with the laws of war, so I can carpet bomb Gaza.
Right.
That is not the way it works. But what it does say is that the fact that Hamas does not comply means that if we are doing our due diligence as an Israeli military or an American military, and we're trying to distinguish between civilian and military, we're trying not to inflict disproportionate losses. When we're operating in good faith, the losses that result are the responsibility of the non-complying power, and that is Hamas or ISIS.
In this case, French goes on to acknowledge that an army facing this kind of circumstances could be tempted to pursue disproportionate responses out of revenge. He's acknowledging that possibility. But then he goes on to argue that outsiders can't really know if any given attack violates these rules without access to privileged information that the Israeli army has behind closed doors when they're making those targeting decisions. That's his basis then when he goes on pretty commonly when he appears on these podcasts to entreat listeners to suspend their judgment about what they are seeing with their own eyes, because it might not be a violation, because they don't have access to that kind of information. So here he is talking about that.
However, there's a temptation that can exist, especially in an atmosphere of anger, rage, and vengeance, where you say, well, Hamas is hiding amongst civilians. It's their responsibility who dies. Let's drop the bigger bomb, you name it. And so what ends up happening, however, though, is there's also this other thing that occurs in urban combat when people are hiding behind civilians that makes it very difficult as an outsider to the conflict to judge what's happening. And this is called the precision paradox, Curtis. So in the precision paradox, a city that is subject to only precision bombing can look at the end of the fight as destroyed as a city that has been carpet bombed. Mm-hmm. And the reason is that you end up destroying with precision weapons essentially the buildings one at a time over the course of the fight, rather than all at once, which you would see in a carpet bombing situation. So if you destroy one building, surviving jihadists flee from that building to another, and you destroy that building, and then the survivors of that flee to another. So you can see how it sort of spider webs out. And that's a term that I've heard, spider webbing. And it can look from a distance. If you're looking at aerial views, for example, if you saw an aerial view of before Fallujah and after Fallujah in 2004, it'd be shocking. If you saw an aerial view of Mosul in 2015 and then another one in 2018 after the 2016-2017 fight for Mosul, it would be shocking to you. But none of that was carpet bombing. It was all precision attacks. So it gets very difficult from a distance to judge whether any given attack is in violation of the laws of war. And so what ends up happening is people look to shortcut systems of analysis. Are there too many civilian casualties? Does the infrastructure look too destroyed? But that gets really hard to judge without the information that led to the targeting decision.
So that's all background to this conversation today, but enough background. Let's dig into it. I'd love to start with Dr. Eric Patterson first, if that's okay. Eric, it's my impression that, without saying that that you are David French, but it's my impression that your perspective is probably most sympathetic to casting Israel's operations in Gaza as in terms of just war. So I'm hoping that we can sort of start there and go from there. Eric also I just want to introduce Eric, and then we're going to jump in. Sorry, I was trying to think through what I wanted to say. I want to say for our listeners as well, before I introduce Eric, that this is not a this conversation today isn't a debate about the merits of just war. I've already shared that with our panelists. What we wanted to do is talk in particular about the ways that the evangelical community in the U.S. has used just war to talk about Gaza. And we can each, from our various perspectives, more of a just war perspective like Dr. Patterson's, or the other perspectives that are going to be represented by the other panelists, can bringing those different backgrounds to this question of how Americans have used just war to think about Gaza and evaluating that. So Eric is a PhD has his PhD in political science from the University of California, Santa Barbara. He's a graduate of the Academy of Military Science, and he has authored more books than I've read in a long time, 20 authored and edited 22 books, including A Basic Guide to the Just War Tradition, Christian Foundations and Cases, with Baker in 2023, and then Just War and Christian Traditions with J. Darrell Charles, who is a former colleague of mine. He and I both worked at Bryan College in Tennessee for a couple of years. So he and I have had passionate times of prayer together. It's fun to see his name pop up there. And Eric is the president and CEO of the Victims of Communism Memorial Foundation. Eric, thanks so much for joining us today.
Ben, it's a pleasure to be with you. And we had a little audio problems beforehand. Are we okay with this setup?
You're coming through loud and clear.
Super. Well, thanks for having me, Ben, and for hosting this important forum with old friends like Susie Hayward, who I have a lot of respect for. And this is a very, very important set of topics.
Eric, so I kind of went through your formal CV. What else would you add that you think it's important for people to know about you as we dig into this conversation?
Well, I think, like a lot of your listeners, I'm an evangelical. Grew up in the church. Thought I was going to be in full-time ministry as a young man. Was a double major of biblical studies and music education at Evangelical University, and felt like God directed my path in a different way after that. But one of the things that's motivated me for the last 2 decades has been how little teaching we have with a classical Christian just war tradition rooted in scriptural texts from the Old and New Testaments, with teaching going back all the way to the very, very beginning of Christianity. But we rarely actually talk about it in church. And so we often leave our young people and our pastors, who actually rarely get much conversation about this in seminary, really at a loss. And so a part of what I've been trying to do as a scholar is to provide resources that are rooted in the way that 2,000 years of Christians have been thinking about very, very difficult issues. And I think perhaps a better way to think about it is as just war statecraft or just statecraft, because it's not only about hot war, but we're
Yeah.
talking about law, politics, society, and justice.
Yeah. That's awesome. And probably a perfect segue. I wanted you to define just war for us, since we're talking about how just war is being applied to Gaza. But maybe the question then becomes, what is just statecraft, and what is just war in that context?
Yeah, so I think at that larger level, what we're talking about are those principles that are throughout the Bible and then have been pulled together over time in what you might call Christian political thought about security and order and justice and vocation. Very briefly, I just note that the Bible actually has a lot to say on those things, and they give rise to this form of just statecraft speaking. For instance, there's the principle of governance and authority throughout the Bible in the natural institutions that God gave us, whether it's the family or the church or government. There's an authority structure. The Bible's a lot to say about vocation, including public service vocations. There are people in the Old and New Testaments who are called to protect, to serve, and to defend, whether it's Joshua, Nehemiah, Hezekiah, Joseph in the Old Testament, or centurions and Cornelius and Zenas the lawyer, the member of Caesar's household, the public administration of the New Testament. The Bible has a lot to say about justice. It has a lot to say about stewardship for leaders, that they have to count the cost, whether building a tower or of the counsel of many wise counselors before going to war. I could go on. The Bible has a lot to say about neighbor love and order in society and things, but it's out of reflection on these things that the Christian just statecraft tradition, and with a real focus on how to be building towards peace, how to preserve order and justice, we typically call that just war thinking. The just war tradition has, once we narrow in on law enforcement, the responsibility of government officials and the military, it's come down to three big questions. The first is what is the morality? What are the ethics of making the decision to use force? And then once legitimate authorities have made that decision, largely in terms of just cause and right intention, a second question comes up, and that is, in these battlefield conditions, what is the appropriate way to fight ethically? And we have criteria for this that we can talk about: military necessity, proportionality, and distinction. And then over time, it was assumed, but in the past quarter century, we've talked a lot more about it explicitly. And I think it's a big concern for us today, is the idea of justice at war's end. What does an enduring late and post-conflict look like? In the Latin, it's called jus post bellum. And there are three principles there: order, justice, and hopefully, although it's very hard in political life, conciliation. And so that's the framing. I'd be happy to talk more about it, but I would just want to maybe end this with, there really is a difference between individual criminality and the responsibility that governments have to protect and defend. There's really a difference between illicit armed groups, whether they're the mafia or terrorists or others, and the responsibility that governments have to defend. And there's a difference in the just war tradition between wrathful, destructive, vengeful violence on the one hand, and the legitimate use of force. Force that's limited, it's within the law, it's in the hand of lawful authorities. And so when we think about these things, there really are some distinctions that the just war tradition helps us to have a mature ethic.
Thanks, Eric. Yeah, so many questions. Love what you're saying. So I guess let's maybe start with this question. In your perspective, does just war theory, and I hear you saying there's a larger framework that this is in, so now I might be focusing in on the three main pillars, pre, during, and post. The jus, ad bellum, in bellum, and post bellum. Does it ever justify too much? I guess this is a question about how it gets used, maybe, and misused. That's maybe where you're going to take it, is how it might be, the ways that it can be misused to justify too much. How flexible is it? How
Mhm.
how easy is it to appropriate?
Mhm. So the simple answer is that, of course, the answer is no, because by definition, things that go outside of these quite clearly specified conditions are go beyond the realm of what is just. But I do recognize that part of what you're asking is, can political leaders try to make an argument that something's justified, and so it's an ends justify the means, kind of a consequentialist ethic.
Mhm.
And let me just point out, to be fair to the question that you're asking,
Yeah.
4 or 5 very quick ways that uh, that in a sense things could be stretched beyond the intentions of the about this restrained tradition. And again, remember, this tradition is about protecting civil order. It's about pursuing justice, right? That's what it's really about. So first, a stretch would be to justify the actions of vigilantes, terrorists, or criminal actors, brigands, pirates, etc., and to say these illicit combatants, well, maybe they're gentlemen warriors or something, when they're really what they do is undermine law. A second one would be, obviously, if a government were to try to justify, let's say that Vladimir Putin's justifications for the war in Ukraine fall into this category, that anything goes because we should just trust the government based on its authority, not even considering just cause or right intention, but a failure would be to say, oh, just trust those in authority on all counts and all occasions. They know what they're doing. A third would be when it comes to right intentions. In other words, you could have authorities acting actually on a just cause. We were attacked December 7th, 1941. But why do we respond? What is the attitude of our heart for responding? And if the attitude is one of we hate the other, we want to crush them there, and we dehumanize them, of course, that's a stretch beyond what the just war tradition is about. A good example of this is what happened during World War I, where Germans not only shot merchant vessels, but German submarine commanders would actually shoot the sailors in the water to kill them. So I would say that there's plenty of ways that people could try to justify something, some sort of militaristic action that violates the fundamental premises of this. But one other thing that we haven't talked very much in the Gaza, in fact, almost no conversation has had, is by actually narrowing too much on a single part of the conflict and not thinking about it at the strategic level. For instance, on October 8th last year, missiles were coming into Israel, not just from Hamas, but from
Hmm.
Hezbollah in Lebanon.
Hmm.
And
Yeah.
so I think one of the failures about not approaching this from a just statecraft perspective is not to see the system of things going on that includes Iran, Houthi rebels in Yemen, Hezbollah, long-term financing, etc. All of those being elements of our analysis.
Totally. Yeah. Really appreciate that. If you want to say more about the larger system, the like regional aspect to this, feel free. Um, and I also wanted to ask about when you see, like, talk a little bit about the complexity of the analysis of when a war might be just in some ways and unjust in other ways. Or the way I have it
Sure.
written here is, can a war be just and be fought unjustly?
Yeah. Well, let me start with something to put a post-it note on and to think about, and that is, why did Hamas do this attack in the first place? And I think that there's at least two primary reasons. One is it was a vengeful, vindictive strike. I've been told that, oh, no, no, there was many Palestinians in Israeli jails, so it was justified. But what didn't happen was a liberation of many people from those Israeli jails. It was the slaughter primarily of civilians. So those two things don't seem to go. So on the one hand, it was a vengeful, vindictive, bitter, destructive strike. And it was destructive, I believe, in a second way that was intended. And that second way was to deal a blow to the peace agreements, three of which had been signed with Israel's neighbors. We call them the Abrahamic Accords. I think that most people will be very happy about these things, but it really scuttled or at least stopped two additional, or maybe three even, peace treaties between Israel and its Arab neighbors. And so the purposes, on the one hand, seemed to be quite destructive, not constructive. It was to stop peace agreements. It was to hurt civilians. It was to strike Israel. And of course, those things are kind of going into this question that you're asking about a just war fought unjustly. Certainly, uh, acts of destruction that seek to cause greater destruction that are intended to stop peace deals from going forward seem beyond the pale. Now, your question, a question that often comes, and that is, can a just war be fought unjustly? Right? I mean, that's really at the heart of it. In other words, could there be a legitimate reason to go to war? It's a government fighting on behalf of a just cause with right intentions. But then, can the war be fought unjustly? I think that the part of the answer to that question is that uh, that every war has some individual miscreants who do things that are bad. Every war has mistakes that are made, and there are chances when governments make deliberate wrong or unethical decisions about the conduct of war. So, for instance, the Vietnam War, over the course of its years, is not an unjust war necessarily. The people of South Vietnam asked for help. The United States was helping in the context of the global war, but that doesn't make the disaster the crime of my lie, where troops deliberately and wantonly killed civilians. That does not make that specific action just under the imprimatur of the American government. It was wrong. It was immoral. But that doesn't make other just acts wrong. So we really need to focus on specific battles, specific decisions, specific campaigns, and both what was done and the intention. That's the Christian, one of the Christian elements in this is a focus on intentions. You asked about the system, and let me just simply say the Iranian government calls itself the leader of an axis of resistance to the West, but also to the Sunni majority Arab governments in its region. And so it has been a spoiler for regional peace and security with militias fighting in Iraq, militias fighting in Syria. It funds Shia terrorist groups like Hezbollah. It funds some, more rarely, uh, Sunni terrorist groups like Hamas. You'll notice that most of the governments in the region do not like Hamas, that they've recognized the Palestinian Authority, not Hamas, as the legitimate voice of the Palestinian Arab Muslim people. And of course, Iran has sowed discord on the Arabian Peninsula, including the arming of the Houthi rebels. Let me just close to give you a sense about what I'm talking about. Iranian money, Iranian fighters, Iranian logistics, and Iranian weapons are awash in this conflict. And the last year, almost 13,000, according to Wall Street Journal today, almost 13,000 missiles have come from Hezbollah in Lebanon into Israel, 13,000, and almost 14,000 have come from Hamas at Israel since October 7th of last year. And that doesn't count missiles from Iran and from other places. By the way, last week, when Iran shot 180 missiles at Israel, here's what's amazing. 5 countries, according to the BBC, helped shoot them down.
Mm-hmm.
The US, the UK, France, perhaps the United Arab Emirates, and Jordan. And so this is suggestive that there's a microcosm happening in the Israel-Hamas conflict, but that's part of a much larger, violent regional system of destabilization that doesn't honor human life.
Thanks, Eric. I've got one last question for you right now, and then we're going to come back to you. This has been really, really helpful and rich conversation. But so let's end for now with looking forward, the post-bellum aspect of this. How would you kind of parse the post-bellum prospects for the regional war, for Gaza, for what you see unfolding there?
Mm-hmm. Well, this is very difficult, and I'm very concerned about generational hatreds being passed to children and to grandchildren, which is not uncommon in the Middle East, and it's very difficult to overcome. Ask the Sudanese or the Afghans or the Congolese about the generational passing off of conflict. The first step is that you have to get to order, which is where there's an opportunity for governance to take root, and then no domestic or international threats to these peoples in the region. And that's a very difficult thing to imagine moving from that to some sort of longer term we can get along. But I will note, first, as I said earlier, that Israel recently signed peace deals with three of its neighbors and was about to sign more, the so-called Abrahamic Accords, which have had bipartisan support in Washington. A lot of that diplomacy happened under the Trump administration, but there are antecedents in the Obama administration and in the Biden administration, with one noticeable difference, and that is how different diplomats view Iran. But I would say this is an extremely difficult situation to understand what those next steps would be. And I would simply note, first of all, efforts made by religious people, by political leaders, and by civil society actors to try to move children, the next generation, beyond a ever-present sense of the other in terms only of bitter wrath, hatred, and revenge is crucial to some sort of change over time. It doesn't mean kumbaya. It doesn't mean everybody loves each other, but it's in the political world, that's the real step. In 1979, the Israelis and the Egyptians signed the Camp David Accords. Now, these were two states that had fought in 48, 56, 67, and 73. The leader was a right-wing hawk in Israel, and it was a former military leader in Egypt. And yet somehow those leaders, and I talk about how that happens in my book, Ending War as well, those leaders were able to broker a cold peace that has now lasted for 45 years. And so don't give up hope that such things are possible, where former adversaries recalculate their interests and take steps towards regional security.
Thank you, Eric. Much appreciated. We're going to come back to you in a little bit. Next, I'd like to have a conversation with Reverend Susie Hayward. Susie is Associate Minister at Mayflower Community Congregational Church in Minneapolis, Minnesota. And I'm going to pause for a moment to say I literally just ran a marathon in the Twin Cities, and I think that I ran really close to your church.
Yeah, you did.
Yeah, it was just a couple blocks away, right?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, when you ran past Lake Nokomis, you were not too far away.
Yeah, that was like the halfway mark, about 13 miles in. So that's fun. And that's actually, I grew up in the Twin Cities. So it felt like a homecoming. Mm-hmm. Susie is a researcher for the Berkeley Center for Religion, Peace, and World Affairs. And just brings two decades of experience in refugee policy, human rights activism, and peace building, including with the UN High Commission for Refugees, the Carter Center, Advocates for Human Rights, and 14 years working for and directing the Religion and Inclusive Societies program at the U.S. Institute of Peace. She has her master's degrees from the Fletcher School of Law and Diplomacy and Harvard Divinity School. And I believe you're working on your PhD at the moment.
Yep, I am. At Georgetown University.
So you're a busy person. You've got lots going on. Susie, what else should we know about you as we jump into this conversation?
Thanks, Ben. And let me just start by saying it's good to be with you. It's good to be with everybody who's joined us today, and with Eric Patterson and Scott Gustafson. I am so grateful to be a part of this discussion and to learn from each of you. And like you started with, Ben, my heart is so heavy today with grief and memory of the horror that took place a year ago on October 7th to the Israelis living in the kibbutzim along the border wall with Gaza, or the young people attending the music festival, and of course the civilian hostages who are taken and held by Hamas. Some of them continue to be held. And heavy with enormous grief for the destruction and horror that has taken place over the last 365 days, for all of those trapped in Gaza who've been suffering from relentless destruction of their infrastructure, schools, places of worship, the enormous loss of life. As we all know, over 40,000, some half of those children. Food insecurity, disease, ongoing escalating violence and land theft that's happening in the West Bank at the same time as this is occurring in Gaza. A lot of that by armed settler movements, sometimes with Israeli military support. now, quite predictably, the growth of the theater of violence into Lebanon and beyond. And as Eric rightly noted, that's not new. There were missiles that were coming in from southern Lebanon very early on, and this has long been a conflict that is not just about the Israelis and the Palestinians, but is about so many other actors who are a part of it, including the United States. And so I'm just consumed with all of that today, and I'm grateful for the opportunity to have a place to be in conversation with some of you about some of the legal and pragmatic issues at the heart of this, but even more so the deeply moral questions that confront all of us in shaping how we respond to this, to what's happening in the Holy Land, the faith values that we draw on from in seeking to shape our response to it. In terms of what you actually asked, Ben, the additional biodata that I would offer, one thing I would want to say that as much as possible today, I'm going to seek to speak from the heart. So yeah, I have that training mentioned in international conflict resolution theory and practice and international law and diplomacy and peace building, and the work in religious studies for my PhD. And in some of these kinds of conversations, I'll put on that diplomatic hat, or I'll put on the academic hat and speak from within that framework and using that language. But as much as possible today, I want to speak wearing the primary hat that I wear these days, which is as an ordained minister in the United Church of Christ, which is a mainline Protestant denomination here in South Minneapolis. And we've been wrestling as a community of faith over the past year about the questions of meaning and purpose and courage in these extraordinary times we're living in, and what our responsibility is as Christians and as American Christians, with the incredible privilege that offers as we seek to follow the Jesus path during these times and come up alongside the oppressed in ways that are both pastoral and prophetic, holding our neighbors here in Minneapolis who are Jewish and Muslim and Arab, and understanding also our neighbors to be those in Israel, Palestine, and neighboring countries who are directly affected by the choices that we as American Christians and our country and in our foreign policy make. It affects our neighbors overseas as well. So that's where I will primarily be kind of grounding myself and seeking to speak from in this conversation.
Thank you. Yeah, mind and heart working together can take us closer to wisdom and insight, can it?
Yeah.
Much appreciated. I wanted to start with kind of a definition question for you, because we're talking about just war and how it's being used to talk about Gaza. But you are actually a thinker in another conversation that is distinct from, as I understand it, just war, and it's also concerned, drawing on ethical principles to think in other ways about peace and peacemaking, and the term for it is called just peace. And I wondered if you could just define just peace for us by way of setting the table for the rest of our chat.
Yeah, and like you said, Ben, just peace is sort of a newer term and a newer sort of framework of thinking and practice, but it has a long tradition, right? Because so many of our religious traditions, including the Christian tradition, has long considered peace, has upheld peace as a principle and a vision and a hope and a prayer for the world, and has sought to identify the ways that make for peace. And so the just peace as a term, just peace making or just peace building as a principle has a lot of foundation that it builds on, even if it's sort of a newer framework that is being put forward to be in conversation with the just war tradition, and for some folks, and in some cases to sort of displace the amount of oxygen that the just war tradition has taken in thinking about how to respond to violent conflict and to peace. But to this question of what is just peace, so simply put, just peace is a context in which all people, or extending that even further to thinking about non-human animals, land, water, all creation, can live with dignity and wholeness into who or what God calls them to be. So we have religious understandings of this kind of vision of just peace and the ideas of shalom from the Jewish tradition, or salam. In the Christian tradition, we talk about the peace of Christ, or the creation of the kingdom of God on earth, which we understand to mean the kind of society Jesus preached about and sought to build through his ministry, in which all people are treated as having equal worth, human needs are met for health, food, shelter. There are relationships of mutuality and love. Those with power are held to account to use that power in ways that do not dominate over others. So in other words, this vision of just peace sees the presence of perfect love and justice at all levels of society, for the individual, for the family, for the corporate, the nation. It's a powerful religious presence that we understand to receive a glimpse of at the communion table in the Christian tradition, that place where we all come together to share a meal, to be fed literally and spiritually as equals at the table, recognizing that there is enough for everyone when we share, and experiencing reconciliation with each other and with God at the table. So that's the religious understanding of just peace. In peace theory, I draw from my understanding of just peace from Johann Galtung and John Paul Lederach, thinkers who put forward this idea of positive peace. So peace as not merely the absence of direct violence, but the presence of just structures, positive relationships between people and entities, institutions, nations. So this vision of peace takes into account the eradication of direct forms of violence that we might think of naturally, bombs, warfare, killings, rapes, and so on. But it also takes into account forms of peace in the understanding of eradication of cultural violence, or structural violence is how Johann Galtung frames it. So cultural violence being the kinds of ideas or ideological frameworks that dehumanize some people or groups. For example, racist ideas or system like race science, like eugenics, and for example, that create ideological systems that dehumanize some groups and make forms of violence against them more tenable, more normalized, more understood to be more reasonable. And then that sometimes gets absorbed into structures and institutions. So structural violence becomes the ways in which those ideas create economic or political systems that privilege some groups over others, making some groups systematically disadvantaged. I also draw a bit from Martin Luther King and Edward Said when I think of just peace. So both wrote about just peace in the context of their work for civil rights in Martin Luther King's case, Palestinian rights in Edward Said's case, presenting it as peace with justice. So in some respects, when they were presenting just peace in their writings, they were critical of dominant understandings of peace around them, and particularly of political liberal peace that was being sort of lifted up, because they saw that those understandings of peace, or those articulations of peace, sometimes entrenched unjust structures that harmed particular communities through lack of, equal access to healthcare, education, and so on. Martin Luther King, you may recall, he wrote from the Birmingham jail of his frustrations of those who called for peace, when that peace meant not disrupting a status quo that was inherently violent towards some, or that called for civility in the form of complacency to an unjust situation. So in that respect, he called for nonviolent resistance as a process of peace building, one that might escalate conflict in some sense, right? That
Sure.
that can escalate tensions, escalate conflict between communities in a nonviolent means, and in a creative means that can create disruptions as a means to build a more just peace. So it's very, in all of these, the religious, the peace theory presentation of it, the Martin Luther King and Edward Said vision of it, it's very idealistic, this idea of just peace. It's something that I think all of these thinkers would agree is not something that's ever achieved completely in an enduring sense.
Yep.
It's not as if you achieve a just peace and it's static and enduring forever. It's something that needs to be constantly worked at, kind of like the way we talk about democracy in this country. It's not an end state so much as a process for working together, seeking to benefit all, recognizing that because of the nature of human sin in our fallen world, it's going to be something that we need to constantly work for and protect and advance, because there will always be aspects of evil, aspects of human sin that are working against it. So until the Messiah comes, until Jesus returns, it's our work as Christians, empowered by the Spirit and the example of Jesus, to keep working towards this just peace and celebrating it in the moments that we experience it in our world and in our lives.
That's really lovely and fascinating. Johann Galtung sounds like someone that I want to follow up on. So here's the question that's forming in my mind. Most ethical people would say their goal in thinking, like in their ethics of violence, would be their goal would be a just peace. So how do you see, what are the differences then? Because I imagine then the differences in perspective between, let's just say, for example, a just peace and a just war perspective would be in methods, and the approach. So what are some of those differences in your experience?
Yeah, it really is. So just peace is one thing, and I think everybody could agree they want a peace with justice. They seek a world and a context in which all people can live with dignity and into wholeness. But how do we get there, especially when there is just the reality of violence around the world? So here I'm going to go a little bit more to the conflict resolution theory and practice, and as a starting place anyway, because we have in peace theory and in understandings of conflict kind of two operating assumptions. The first is that conflict's inevitable in human society, and two, that conflict is an opportunity. Now, note that I'm saying conflict, not necessarily violent conflict, but violent conflict, I would say, is in the reality of our world also inevitable, and can also be an opportunity. So first, on the first side, conflict is inevitable. To paraphrase the scriptures, wherever two or more are gathered, we'll have conflict, right? It's inevitable, it's natural, and it can be useful. So this is where we get to the second half of it. Conflict is an opportunity. It's about how we respond to conflict when it arises. There are ways that we can respond to it in healthy ways and unhealthy ways. So it's really about human response to conflict that we need to be focusing on and thinking about, than the just peace building as a process forward. Usually always, I would say, actually, when conflict arises, it's when something's not right. There's something disordered in society, some disease under the surface, some harm that's being experienced, some broken relationship between individuals or peoples or people in institutions that needs to be addressed. There's a structural issue that's going on that is at the heart of violent conflicts when they arise. But even with respect to interpersonal relationships, when conflict arises, it's because something went wrong. There was a form of communication, or there was some dynamic that was going on in the relationship that needed to be addressed. So it's sort of a warning sign to us that, hey, something's going on that needs to be looked at. When we can't, as I said, we can't rid our world of conflict, but we can think about how we respond to it when it arises by seeking to understand what's going on underneath, to address the root causes and the underlying disease. Not thinking that we're going to resolve the conflict simply by looking at the symptoms of it, like the forms of direct violence that create victims. Ideally, as those wanting to build peace, we're holding both when violent conflict breaks out. We're seeking to address the forms of direct violence, to reduce the suffering, to reduce the victims, to protect civilians, all of the things related to jus in bellum that Eric was speaking to. But we're also seeking to do the deep transformative work for healing and building just peace through tending to the root causes. If you don't do that, if you're only addressing the symptoms, the violence, then you're likely to just extend the conflict or even exacerbate it, making the achievement of just peace even further out of reach. So I fear that we have this sort of dominant mentality in our world, including here in the US, that violence can solve problems. And we tend to assume that if we're responding to a violent episode in the geopolitical realm, that if we aren't responding to a violent episode in the geopolitical realm militarily, then we aren't doing anything to address the problem. And I have principled reasons that I argue that violence cannot be our means to achieve justice or a response to violence. And that position is rooted largely in the example of Jesus, which I can say more to. But there's actually a lot within peace theory and practice that says you don't need to depend solely on principled arguments for nonviolence to respond to violent conflict or injustice. There's good evidence to show that nonviolent resistance movements can and have been more successful than violent movements in achieving their aims. If you want to read more about this, Why Civil Resistance Works by Maria Stefan and Erica Chenoweth is a good place to start. They've done a lot of quantitative research to show the success of nonviolent movements in achieving aims versus violent movements. But effective just peacemaking is also, I want to hasten to say, it's about more than just good intentions and actions rooted in compassion, right? It's not just about idealistically kumbaya, as Eric was saying. It's strategic. It's grounded in a shared vision and set of values, and it's sustained. So it tends to both the horizontal relationships in society between individual communities and people, and the vertical dimensions of society, the relationships between state institutions and peace building. So just peace building becomes that work of building just peace, reflecting the end goal that it seeks. It's seeking to be inclusive, seeking to be creative, seeking to be nonviolent and relational in the way it goes about building peace, not peace as the end it's seeking.
Susie, one of the things that you said that struck me was about root causes and paying attention to root causes instead of going right to a military or forceful response, allowing an experience of conflict to prompt you to look at what are the root causes of this conflict and to start working there. That really struck me. And it's, when I think about Gaza and the kind of discourse in American Christians community about Gaza that we're talking about today, one of the things that comment brings up for me is it okay to talk about the root causes of Hamas's violence? And in some cases it's not. That's a kind of it's off the table because they're a terrorist organization. Their violence is illegitimate. And that's about all that can be said before the conversation needs to move on to something else. For example, Israel's response is then just. Do you see that parallel? And maybe you can, I'm kind of skipping forward here because we're wanting to fit a lot in, but maybe talk a little bit about how this framework, this just peace framework, might bring some resources for thinking about Gaza and the conversation that we're having.
Yeah. So obviously this situation did not begin a year ago. And I think what is really important for us as a moral question and as Christians seeking to follow the Jesus path through this is to think about, for all of those involved in this, what's underlying, what's going on underneath, what are the basic human needs that are not being addressed, what are the forms of grief and trauma. We were just speaking to Eric's concerned about the generational trauma that may result from what's taken place over the past year. But of course, there's already been generational trauma, right? I mean, for the Israeli state and for Jewish people in Israel, and more broadly, there's the generational trauma of the Holocaust, which was not that long ago and is very real. And the experience a year ago reignited a lot of that generational trauma that has not yet been healed and has had a hard time healing in the context of a situation where there's a great deal of insecurity that's ongoing for Jewish people who are living in Israel and were seeking a safe homeland for themselves. And there's the generational trauma of what's called the Nakba on the Palestinian side. So when the Israeli state was created and the displacement and the violence that happened to the Palestinian Arab people who were living on that land when it occurred, and then what they sometimes refer to as the ongoing Nakba, which is the forms of military occupation that they're living under that has restricted rights, restricted freedom of movement, has led to sort of ongoing forms of structural violence, cultural violence, and forms of direct violence. And so there already is generational trauma and grief that has been experienced and ignited, and it complicates the efforts to for empathy, the ability to encourage the kind of trust and courage that's necessary in order to be able to move forward to address some of those root causes. I think, for me, I'm always going to go back to Jesus, and I'm always going to go back to the model of Jesus and the teachings of Jesus. For me, that's primary source material. Everything else from the Christian tradition, which I also draw on, including the just war tradition, international law and humanitarian law, which is derived in large part from the Christian just war tradition, and human rights and so on. That is all critical as well, fodder. But for me, the primary source material is the teachings and the example of Jesus that is offered in the gospel accounts and the gospel ethic, as I say it. And it's critical to recall Jesus's plea for us to again and again look at the margins, to the dispossessed, the powerless, including the war orphan and the widow, and to understand the ways in which power is operating in ways that are often unequal and harm particular communities over others. And so holding all of the generational trauma, grief, the feelings of insecurity that all of those in the region experience right now, I think if you apply that kind of power analysis that Jesus asks us to the current context in Israel and Palestine, there's a kind of a blatant inequality of power that's operating. A lot of the just war tradition that we get from Christianity and humanitarian law as we have it now operates on the assumption of sovereign states at war with one another. But in the context here, we have a state with a really sophisticated military operation, and then we have a people who are stateless and who do not have a formal military and do not have a similar kind of diplomatic power, which is not a question of saying who's right and who's wrong, who's on the side of good and who's bad, but it's to bring that kind of analysis into account to understand then how do we come up alongside and understand those who have less power in this situation and their needs, and seek to, with compassion for all involved, without dehumanizing all involved, seek to stand both prophetically and pastorally with the dispossessed. I take a lot of my own sort of model here, the Palestinian Christian community, who of course see themselves as descendants of Jesus and the early Christian community, and who've lived on the land in Bethlehem and so on for generations since the time of Jesus. And their model of responding to an unjust situation that they're experiencing under military occupation with nonviolence, in ways that do not dehumanize, in ways that come up alongside their Muslim Palestinian siblings as well as Jewish allies in Israel and beyond, to acknowledge the unjustness of the status quo that has existed for decades in that context, and to call for a living on the land, a resistance to that nonviolently in love, and a sharing of the land by those who are on it now in ways that allow for the dignity and the inclusion of all. And so I take, the Munther Isaacs, the Daoud Nassers, some of the really courageous and beautiful Palestinian Christians who I think have done a remarkable job trying to hold that balance of prophetic and pastoral in that context to call for nonviolent resistance.
That's lovely. Thanks, Susie. I think my quote of the day from you is that Jesus is my source material. So everything else is maybe a little bit more than footnotes to that, but secondary to that. So thanks for that. We'll certainly come back to you too. I'd like to bring in Dr. Scott Gustafson next. Scott is actually my colleague at in the hat that I wear at Churches for Middle East Peace. He's the current Ambassador Warren Clark Fellow. It's been a joy getting to know him too in this role. He has his PhD in religion and theology from, what's the name of it?
Vrij Universiteit.
Okay. In
my Dutch accent's horrible.
Gotcha. In de-radicalization, extremism, and religious conversion. So those are themes that are going to be really relevant for our conversation. He's a member of the Extreme Beliefs and Strong Religion Working Group at VU. He earned his MA in Intercultural Studies, Middle East Studies from Moody Graduate School, studied Arabic at the University of Jordan, and has extensive experience in the Middle East as a practitioner and consultant with faith-based charities and churches in humanitarian relief and mission work. Scott, it is great to have you in this conversation. I wonder what else you'd like listeners to know about you as we jump in.
Yeah, thanks, Ben. Appreciate you trusting all of us, Susie, Eric, and I with this important day and conversation. Yeah, maybe some other helpful background. We got involved in the Middle East, moved to Jordan in 2004, and it was right after preparing to go. 9/11 happened, so the war in Iraq was kind of in the context of our, initial entrance into this whole world. The war on terror, tons of Iraqi refugees. Just a year after we moved, the Jordan hotel bombings happened. Our house was like right in the middle of all these hotels that were simultaneously targeted. Then the Syrian crisis happened, and we were involved in some of the humanitarian relief efforts happening at that time. So I've been kind of thick in this environment of injustice, extremism, war, violence, and grappling with all these things myself for quite a while. My research focused on interviewing 52 former extremists and some of the clergy and humanitarian staff that worked with them. And so, like Susie, I really resonate with kind of the heart issues here and hearing people's stories. So you'll hear me kind of vacillate back and forth between kind of the theologian hat and the researcher hat, along with just telling the story of real people on the ground. So it's quite complicated. I'm in the midst of all these. You hear a lot of Christians, as you've said in the beginning, go to these big concepts like just war. And I think I do too. We forget that there's real people involved. Like, these are families that are enduring horrible things right now. And so that's kind of the heart that I come to this with.
Thanks, Scott. Much appreciated. I know that you appreciate a lot of what pacifism offers as a Christian tradition. So, and that certainly would be kind of another ethical framework that's relevant to the conversation we're having. We won't go deeply in there, but I wonder if you could just give us like a thumbnail definition of pacifism alongside just peace and just war that we've been talking about.
Yeah, in the pacifist tradition, we see still quite a few communities, Quakers, Mennonites, upholding the idea that any violence whatsoever, including war, is not justified in any circumstances. Disputes should always be settled by peaceful means. So there's all kinds of different kinds of pacifists. You might hear of like an absolute pacifist or a relative pacifist. Some would allow for self-defense, a violent act in self-defense, and some would not. It's important too that it's a moral and theological position, much like these other traditions that we've been discussing, very rooted in the early church. So pacifists would point back to the first 300 years of church history and say that church fathers under no circumstance condoned military service for Christians, for example, and violence was strictly disavowed under any circumstance in the first 300 years. Now, in that context, they were a minority community living under an authoritarian state, and things changed, and just war tradition developed as Christianity, beginning with Constantine, grew incredibly, and now we have Christian rulers in power. So it adds in complexity when we consider the historic context there. So pacifists, in summary, would advocate for the resolution of wars, no violence, advocate for peace before hostilities break out. They have much in common with the just peacemaking tradition. In fact, there's a lot of pacifists who advocate for that. Just peacemaking, as was shared, broadens the ideal of no violence as a strict kind of directive from Jesus to a very practical application in the complex global conflict. So we should figure out in the just peace framework how to promote human rights and religious liberty and foster just economic development and very practical things like that. So that's kind of an overview sketch, if you will.
That's great. I want to pause here because I forgot to just remind our other panelists that once Scott and I are done, we'll have a couple of minutes for conversation, and I just wanted to maybe suggest, because it's going to be brief, that as I'm finishing the conversation with Scott, that you're gathering a few comments in response to the overall conversation that we've heard. If there's a point of clarification you'd like to make, maybe a question that you'd like to ask another panelist, and just, what are the 2 or 3 things that you would really like to make sure to offer back into the conversation once we get to that part?
Mm-hmm.
Scott, so do you think of yourself as a pacifist? You don't really, but you draw on pacifism.
Yeah, certainly. It is funny. Like, man, I haven't landed that plane. I'm not sure I'm going to. I think I would say I'm much more of a just peace kind of, if I had to pick a framework and had to choose one or against the other. But as I said, a lot of pacifists are very much in the just peace camp too. So,
so from wherever it is that you're standing, sort of in the pacifist / just peace framework, how do you respond to the idea that what Israel is doing in Gaza is just? Like, even thinking about like what David French has been talking about.
Sure. Yeah, it is funny, even from my kind of chair of thinking as a theologian, and he's got some good points. I mean, I resonate with a lot of them. If I put myself in the shoes of a decision maker in the state apparatus, I'm quite sympathetic to, and even to Israel's particular case of continual aggression from the axis of resistance and the threats that they've endured and the history of the Holocaust and what Hamas did 365 days ago. Israelis have the right to be upset and demand defense and security from their government, and I sympathize a lot with that. I think where I diverge is not so much the hat of someone who serves in government, but if we think in our context of our faith, of Christianity, a lot of times we're mixing and matching those hats. We're thinking in the logic of the state and not in the logic of the kingdom that Jesus established. So if we are praying for the kingdom to come as it is in heaven here on earth, something of that peaceful kingdom where conflict is no more ought to be present in the life of the church and in the life of those of us who follow Jesus as our example. So I try to reconcile those two. I think even many Israelis are speaking out against what their government is doing, and that gives me pause as well, saying the war is unjust, from religious leaders to former combatants, soldiers themselves. I'll quote a Lebanese friend who said to me recently, I don't know the context. This is his quote. I don't know the context where just theory, just war theory was developed, but I live where it's being implemented, and it is anything but just. So I hear reports of children taken from their homes in the middle of the night, denied rights of due process, abused in detention, no freedom of movement, the walls that have gone up, civilian casualties, a seeming, at least on the outside, an unwillingness to negotiate or pursue a kind of peaceful means to this conflict, a reticence to move towards de-escalation and think about the what after, the dehumanizing rhetoric casting all Palestinians as subhuman or animals. I might even say from my background that some of this, and certainly the Hamas rhetoric towards Israelis is very similar, qualifies as extremism. And it gives me great pause. So I don't think there's much justice on either side of what Hamas did, and the Israeli response gives me great pause in that.
So the last kind of thing I want to explore with you before we go to questions, it has to do with your research with extremists and de-radicalization and conversion, which I'm kind of connecting in my mind to some of what Susie was talking about when she was talking about attention to root causes. I think that might be where you're, or at least part of where you're taking us, is being able to attend to extremists as people in an effort to understand patterns of motivation, grievance, and so on. So, Scott, I wonder if you would just share a little bit. What do you think we should know about that?
Yeah. So when I interviewed former militants, and other researchers have done the same, the interesting piece is terrorist movements usually do end, but they don't end normally because of violent suppression. So that's a really interesting fact. Like one researcher said straight out, like, terrorism is repulsive. I get it. The basic instinct to fight force with force is as old as Machiavelli in the Old Testament. And here's her quote: "What a shame that the modern historical record fails to support such a noble impulse." It doesn't work, she's saying. And the research indicates that mine did too. So former extremist terrorists say that here's a few things that were themes in the people I interviewed. Surprising kindness of an enemy caused them to reconsider their violence. Food, medical provision, housing, schooling, these tangible acts of empathy that brought dignity to human beings caused them to reconsider. Invitations to relationships and belonging in community, sharing a table, sharing a meal. And mutual transformation, when a perpetrator confesses that what they did was wrong and invites the other to forgive them. This confession, this mutual transformation that then happens because of that vulnerability, are some of the reasons that former extremists say they left their ways. So I do think that there's some good data out there that seems to indicate that these retributive responses to violence don't work. And that the reasons, if we really want to see people change in their wayward ways, in committing acts of violence or hating a people group, whatever it is, the data seem to indicate that we ought to do the Jesus thing, and inviting people into relationship, providing for their basic needs, ensuring human dignity, and acting in kind ways towards our enemies seems to invite the response we're looking for.
Scott, thanks. Much appreciated. I want to pause before we get to our conversation and say just a word about the Network of Evangelicals for the Middle East. We exist for conversations just like this one. This discussion is one of many that we're having at NEMI, especially this year. Topics that come up in the evangelical community in particular in response to Gaza. So I think that we're going to have another one coming up that will key off of this one and drill down even more into the laws of war and how evangelicals in the U.S. have been thinking about and using the laws of war as a framework for thinking about Gaza. Broadly, NEMI is committed to examining evangelical biblical interpretation about the Middle East and helping evangelicals explore widespread misperceptions and mythologies about the Israel-Palestine conflict that grow out of certain interpretations of Scripture. To learn more, you can go to our website, nimi.network. You can join us in person. We're going to be in Santa Barbara, I think a place that Eric went to school, if I remember correctly. Near there in Santa Barbara. We're going to be there in December for our annual forum to pray, learn, and seek the Lord together about what's happening in Israel and Palestine. And we are donor funded as well. You can learn more and donate at our website. Okay, back to the conversation. We're going to pull our panelists back, I think all of us back onto, yes, look at that. Hi, friends.
Hey.
Good to have you back. I really appreciate hearing from each of you, the unique kind of individual contributions that you're making. And now I know that we're close to time, but we started a little bit late too. So listeners, I hope that you'll bear with us as we squeeze in a conversation. And I wanted to give each of you a chance to respond to what you've heard from the others, even just sort of briefly, and we can see if there's conversation that needs to be had from those responses. But I think we'll go in reverse. Actually, Scott, you just finished, so I'm going to give Susie a chance. Then we'll go to Scott. Then we'll go to Eric.
I actually feel like Eric should be able to go first because Scott and I got a chance to kind of respond to the others a little bit in our comments. But let me just say that, Scott, a lot of what you were saying about the sort of principle and pragmatism of just peacemaking versus pacifism really resonates with me. Again, when I go back to my primary source material in Jesus, I'm very sympathetic to the historic peace churches, like the Quakers and the Mennonites in the pacifist position. But one thing that Glenn Stassen and some of the others who have developed this just peacemaking paradigm and framework have emphasized is that the pacifism is not passive, right? So that there's always that kind of active resistance that's happening as a part of what we would call the just peacemaking or just peace building process, to address some of those root drivers and to call to account the actors on all sides who are contributing to forms of violence, including within our own communities, who are contributing to ideas and structures that create violence. And Eric, I think, I mentioned that I sometimes feel like the just war tradition sucks the oxygen from the room when it comes into the chat, right? It all becomes about whose violence is legitimate and how do we screen the violence. And the conversation about the peace element sometimes gets pushed to the side. And I think some of the articulation of the just peacemaking as a framework and as a process is an attempt to try to bring that into the conversation, to say, setting aside this question of whose violence is right and whose violence is wrong and what kind of violence can we use, what are we doing to advance the just peace building? I think the rise of the jus ad bellum is starting to bring that into the conversation, even within the just war tradition. And I wonder what you would think in response to that idea of thinking about what needs to be in place and what is the responsibilities of those in conflict to create the conditions for a just peace to take root, is bringing some of that just peacemaking or just peace building framework into just war tradition in a way that's modern or new or pushes against.
Would either of you like to respond? We could dive into a little conversation.
Go ahead, Eric.
Well, just Susie, thanks for raising that. And I think that for a long time, the end of peace was just assumed, hence the heavy scholarship for the past 20 years by myself and many others, that I think is a bridge to some of the things that you're talking about, but a focus on thinking through what are the structural conditions of peace. What does that look like, and what are the responsibility of political leaders who have a responsibility for millions of people at a given time in terms of looking towards those types of things. Then I would like to come back to a couple of other things in a bit, but just on this, one of the areas though that I think where there's that makes it very, very hard to scale is so often the discussions about just peacemaking or civil disobedience are very, very localized. And so they're either about interpersonal relationships between individuals or a small group, but they're not talking about millions of people in society
Mhm.
over a long period of time. And so they can be quite complementary, actually, as long as we're recognizing what many call the distinction between the levels of analysis, the individual level, what
Mhm.
happens in domestic society, where you have some level of law and order and some commonality of culture, and how different that is from international relations, where you have groups in conflict with very, very different backgrounds. An example of this is civil disobedience in the case of Martin Luther King Jr. that came up. King famously the opined in the sense that if you're dealing within a democratic system, what you're calling for is the rights of people, for all citizens within the system to be equal under the law that already exists, which is what he wanted in the United States. You can be a Gandhi. But if you're fighting an illegitimate regime in a true resistance movement, you may have to be like Dietrich Bonhoeffer. And what he was pointing out at the time is that there really is a difference about calling for a government to live up to the promises that it has on paper versus fighting a regime that doesn't even see you as human and is violently attacking you. And I think that so we want to be looking at what is this a case of, and kind of apply the tools that we have that are the best ones. Uh, I knew Glenn Stassen for many years. He's a famous book and a famous training program on just peacemaking. He was at Fuller Seminary for a long time. We shared the stage multiple times. I brought him to speak to my students. But I really do think that Glenn often had it backwards. Now, I'll give you an example. Glenn called for stopping the war that was going on in Kosovo in 1999. Now, remember, the Serbian dictator, who had essentially been massacring Bosnian Muslims 5 years before, turned his attention on the Kosovar population and starts crushing them. And unlike in the early 1990s, where the international community moved slowly, this time NATO, led by the United States, moved fairly quickly to start an aerial campaign to get it to stop. What Glenn called for under his just peacemaking was for young adults from Western countries to go and act as human shields to stop the bombing, not the bombing of the Serbs bombing the Kosovars. He was calling on young people to go and protect the Serbian military. And this is the kind of bizarre backwards approach that doesn't try to stop the injustice, but rather tries to to, to maximize the leverage against Western governments who are trying to save human lives and things. It's really worth looking in this very specific instance. The reason I bring that up is it's very worth looking at what is the best way to stop the killing, to move towards justice, and then to set the conditions for some sort of political conciliation and cooperation over time. That's the most likely way for us to get to some sort of peace.
Scott, Susie.
Yeah, I think one of the things that comes to mind in the just making tradition, peacemaking tradition, and pacifism is, and Susie referred to it as how idealist they are. And I referred to this tendency for Christians, and maybe for those of us in our audience who identify as evangelical, the way I've heard people process war, going all the way back to my first experience I alluded to in the Middle East with the war on terror, is primarily through the lens of the state. And many of us, most of us, don't have the privilege of serving in government in those state capacities. And Jesus talked about his kingdom coming, we being citizens of that kingdom, and that kingdom operates under a different set of principles. Now, you may call them idealist, and the Sermon on the Mount certainly is an idealist list of portraying this society that operates in a very different way. But if that's our sort of guiding principle, instead of the logic of the state, I think that has to enter the conversation at some point. And so I sympathize a great deal with what Eric's saying, with what other just war proponents have said too, even about this particular war. But I feel like in many cases, it gives Christians the sort of out to not think necessarily about the ethical implications of violence, and in line with what Jesus said. And so this is the tension there, and why I have such a hard time, Ben, like even nailing myself down. Where do I land as far as a theory? But instead of justifying violence after it's broken out, and how do we deal with this very real conflict that's ongoing, asking the question, how do we bring about peace in the first place? And so this gets at that, and I think that's where the rubber meets the road.
Hey, Ben, can I just pick up on something? Scott made a very important point.
Yes.
And that is, there really is something here about how do Christians see their role in the New Testament era. The Schleitheim Confession of 1527, which lays out the Anabaptist position, says, as Christians, we cannot operate really in any part of public administration, any government role, because there's a level of coercion there, Romans 13. And so we'll pray for government officials because we live in a fallen world and we need them to execute justice. But we as Christians have to totally bow out of that. But that has really been the minority position in Christianity for the past 2 millennia. The position of the Orthodox, the Catholic, and almost all Reformation churches, with a tiny, less than 1% of Christendom view of the Anabaptists, has been that there are vocations that it can be actually a holy calling to be called into public service. In other words, we believe that Protestants believe that all licit vocations are ones that can have the imprimatur of God to serve their fellow man. And it's noteworthy that we've talked a little bit about what Jesus had to say, but it's worth remembering Jesus said that a Roman centurion had more faith than anyone in Israel. That in the time of Peter, it was Cornelius, a Roman centurion who was not rebuked for being a Roman centurion, but was the first, in a sense, formal foreign convert. That John the Baptist told the Roman centurions not to drop their swords or to quit their jobs, but to not use their position to disenfranchise the local population. We don't have any teaching in the New Testament that people can't be serving in public service vocations just as they served in the Old Testament. And so it really is a difference. This is a cleavage point in thinking about these issues. If we go down the path that says that this whole realm of public service, being a magistrate, being a judge, being in law enforcement, being an elected government official, anything that's a part of the state is somehow at best second class, or a very, very different, or perhaps even a sinful vocation for people to serve.
And with that, my goodness, there's so much more that could be said. For the sake of time, we have to stop at some point. So we're going to stop right now, and I'm going to say thank you so much to our panelists. This is the part where if we were live, I'd be asking our audience to express their gratitude. Maybe you can do that as you're listening in the comments. Express your gratitude to our panelists that way. And then to point forward to a couple of ways that we will extend this conversation forward. So in the coming months, the Sermon on the Mount was mentioned. I'm so glad that Scott mentioned that, because there's a new book out by a friend of mine, Andrew DeCourt, and it's about the Beatitudinal way. He walks us through the Beatitudes and proposes that it really is the centerpiece of Jesus' teaching. And if that's the case, what does that mean for us today? And so he's going to join us and talk a little bit about his book. And he's going to be joined by Reverend Munther Ishak, a Palestinian Christian theologian that Susie mentioned, as a conversation partner to him to talk about how, because he's read the book as well, and Munther Ishak called Andrew's book The Way to Peace. This is the way to peace. and so he'll talk about what that means for him as a pastor in Palestine, reading those words. That's coming up in a month or two. And then we also have a conversation in the works that will take this conversation and drill down into some of the specifics of October 7th and the following, specifically in the context of Gaza. And so we invite you back for those. Thanks again to Churches for Middle East Peace for co-sponsoring. Thanks to our panelists, and thank you all for being here. And Hannah, behind the scenes, thanks for producing for us. All the best. And panelists, if you could hang on for just a minute.
Thanks, Ben.